Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I'm very glad to see you because it is with great honor and that I'm able to welcome today a wonderful guest to the channel. And I think he is someone who many of you know already because he is such a legend and he is one of my heroes. And so I admit to being very excited about this conversation and interview coming up. And it's the one, the only Sam Hatch. So Sam,
Thank
welcome.
you.
Welcome. It's
Thank
a
you, my
real
friend.
pleasure to see you here. I'm so honored that you made the time to come here. I'm really thrilled about this.
No, thanks so much for the invite. I was hoping, our first chat would be, over coffee or something, perhaps in Tokyo, but circumstances have not allowed that to be a possibility yet. But this is a fantastic substitute.
Yeah,
Very
well,
glad to be
never
over there.
say never. Never say never about that. And
Indeed.
we'll have to wait and see how all this transpires over the course of however many months or heaven forbid years. But hopefully it'll be done very soon. And once that happens, we will definitely have that coffee.
Fantastic. Sign me up.
Yeah. Most definitely, my friend, most definitely. And so I'm so thrilled to have you on, Sam, because as I mentioned before, you are one of the great legends of sort of film fan world, the film collecting world, physical media, software and hardware, and laserdisc collecting. And also, you are an artist and a musician. So, you are a person who has many artistic hats, as it were, which is so splendid. And I got to know you in terms of laserdiscs and laserdisc collecting. And I've been such a fan of yours, and I've been a follower of yours for such a long time. And as I say, you are one of my great heroes, and so you are one of the great inspirations for me in terms of collecting and film watching and film loving and laser discs. And so I just wanted to let you know that up front. I'm such a huge fan. I've always been such a great fan of yours, Sam.
Absolutely honored. Thank you, my friend.
I mean,
And congratulations on your channel. Coming so far since I think we were just kind of interacting on Facebook on the Laziness Forever group. You were posting some short videos, and it snowballed.
Oh, and I am very grateful for that. But I have to say that I owe so much. Well, I have to say a couple things. First of all, I owe so much to you and to the Laserdisc fan communities online, Laserdisc Forever. I owe you so much because I think without you and without LDF, this my channel wouldn't be here. It wouldn't be in existence. And so, because LDF is a very encouraging community, and it was the first place that I was able to put videos up. And also because of you and your videos, and you mentioned me in one of your, I think, Criterion Laserdisc videos,
Yeah, my
or where
pleasure.
and I was so honored. I when I saw that, I immediately told my wife, and I was, oh my goodness, look, he mentioned me. Look, and my wife was, oh, that's great. So, but but I was so thrilled with that, and and so I that had a lot to do in terms of my own motivation. And so I want to thank you for that. Also, I just want to say that it's as I say, my knowledge base is nowhere near as high as yours. I mean, I wish I knew 1/10 of 1% of what you know, and because your knowledge and your expertise and your intelligence are just uh, every day, every time, I'm just overwhelmed and just I'm overwhelmed on the one hand, but I'm not surprised on the other hand because you are indeed that kind of person. You are so full of knowledge. So, so thank you very much for that. But speaking of that, I want to ask you
Thank you.
first, Sam. Since you're here, I want to ask you first of all, just as a general uh, a general way of introducing who you are. Could you just let us know what were some of your first memories of films that you watched growing up? What were some of those films that you watched that were the milestones of your own film journey? And what were some of those films that you would say, looking back now, really formed who you are as a film fan, as a Laserdisc fan, and as a person in general?
My first memory of being in a cinema was, yeah, I mean, there might have been a few drive-in memories from before that, but I absolutely remember seeing Star Wars for the first time in 1977 in West Hartford, Connecticut. And I was dismayed at first because my father had gone and seen it. He was like the alpha child in the family, and he would go and tell things first, and then afterwards, he'd go again and bring me along. And he'd gone and seen Star Wars probably on the opening day, and then was enthusing about it. And I was, well, come on, I want to see it too. But of course, some timing. I wasn't in school at the time, but there was some sort of issue. Either I was in daycare or something to that effect. So I was 4 years old at the time. And he certainly brought me and a few of the other kids from the neighborhood to go see Star Wars. And my only major memory is, of course, being blown away at the Star Destroyer passing overhead. And then when Carrie Fisher's Princess Leia appeared on screen, I apparently yelled out, "She's pretty," to the joy of the auditorium. They thought it was hilarious. So, yeah, I distinctly remember that. There was a huge slate of drive-in experiences at that time. I had a 99-cent theater in my town, second run cinema. So if we missed something first run or the drive-in, we could go see it there. Saw everything from Message from Space to the China Syndrome. It was like a weird mixture of things. And it was the 70s, so my parents were a little more relaxed in terms of guidelines of ratings and that sort of thing. And then, my parents, much like a lot of kids in my age group, had divorced in the 70s. And that kind of set up this interesting Wild West where I could get away with things at my dad's house and see films like The Blues Brothers before it was officially sanctioned by my mom. And I ended up seeing a lot of things that informed me. Some Kubrick at a fairly young age. 2001: A Space Odyssey. I remember really wanting to experience, because that was one of the first films that I heard people talking about as an important film or of an artistic milestone. And the man who became my stepfather, would regale me with these tales of seeing it in Cinerama, and I forgot what he didn't even enjoy it the first time he saw it. He was a little too young. So I kind of took that as a challenge, that this was going to be a film that I would have to pay attention to and actually possibly think about a little bit to understand the meaning behind it. So I just remember sitting there with my French fries on my little folding snack tray. I'm seeing that on television. Sadly, I didn't get to see it in 70 millimeter until years later. But that definitely, formed my, burgeoning cineast lifestyle. And but then, on the counterpoint, there was all these junky car chase movies, and so I always had one foot in either realm. So there was a little bit of a cineast in me, but then there was also a cinema junk food lover in there as well. So and that certainly kind of defined my nature going on forever. Vertigo, skipping ahead very, very far ahead, was a key film for me. That wasn't until I really discovered that until 96, 97. So that jumps farther ahead. But I mean, that's as terms of like a milestone that really made me think about getting into film discussion, or maybe going along those lines. That actually stemmed from seeing 12 Monkeys, which interesting. It's this weird kind of Ouroboros snake eating its tail, because 12 Monkeys, Terry Gilliam's film, is a remake of or an adaptation of Chris Marker's La Jetée, which is a beautiful short film. It's mostly still images, but absolutely beautiful. And that features a fairly direct reference to Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, in terms of there's a scene in Vertigo where they're in, I think it's Muir Woods in Northern California, and looking at a hewn section of a tree stump, and determining Kim Novak is possibly a reincarnation of this woman named Carlotta Valdez, and she's pointing out where her the possessed spirit within her passed away, and that sort of thing, and that's referenced a bit in La Jetée. And then, just to kind of seal the deal, Terry Gilliam included a scene in 12 Monkeys in which Bruce Willis's character and Madeline Stowe's character are they're on the lam for half the film, and they're actually hiding inside a cinema towards the latter portion of the film, and they're watching Vertigo. And I must have run across bits of it before, maybe on TV. Obviously, I was a Psycho fan. That was Forbidden Fruit. I probably should have mentioned that as well. That was one of the films where I was allowed to see portions of it, but then was informed that I had to leave the room, before the big reveal towards the end, and some of the more shocking elements, the shower scene, obviously. So I was inspired by Hitchcock, certainly, and but Vertigo somehow eluded me, and probably because I wasn't ready for it. And when it hit me, I was watching 12 Monkeys and thinking, wow, I've seen. And it's funny because Bruce Willis is having the exact same experience watching the film, thinking, I've seen this before. This seems familiar. And I was having the same sort of deja vu, and I immediately sought out the film and was just completely blown away. And then within a year, the restoration came out, so I was able to see it in 70 millimeter with the DTS soundtrack, which has some detractors, but still, it was an amazing experience. And that I don't know, that kind of spurred me on to even more aspirations of discussing film and just hanging out with my friends and roommates. And I worked with a gentleman who I later started the radio talk show about film with, and just all the films that we saw together and were inspired to chat about, created this drive to really start putting together some sort of film discussion group. And we eventually started a radio show in 2002 called Culture Dogs, where I have stolen my name from. So he gave his blessing. So, but yeah, there's been a few more films over the years, but definitely those moments are the ones that really kind of jump out at me as defining moments in my cinema viewing life.
That is really interesting, and I must say that the journey that you had with Vertigo, where you went from was it 12 Monkeys and then La Jetée,
Yeah,
right? And then to Vertigo. I think that's
and then to Vertigo.
Yeah, that's very apt in its circularity in terms of Vertigo. I think that's really wonderful. Yeah, that's fantastic.
And to be fair, the first time I saw Vertigo, it's funny. There's a few films that I have this experience with, in which the subject matter, I fell in love with the film, much like Scotty falls in love with Kim Novak's character in the first portion of the film. And then as it kind of falls apart for him and the obsession grows, it's not that I disliked the film, but I felt a similar sense of longing for the film that had been in the first half. And it took me a viewing or two to come to terms with that and realize that, I still loved it all the way through. But there was that sense that the romance and the kind of mystery of that portion had been pulled away from me, and I longed to recapture it. And so I've had a real fascinating personal connection to that film in particular. And hearing Martin Scorsese talk about a similar experience with it being a personal film, when there was a special featurette on the restoration when it came on home video, and that's when I realized I was in good company for sure.
with the that orange, that bright orange cover, right? The VHS and then
Absolutely.
the DVD, which was that was the time when DVD was just starting, right, in terms of a commercial market. Am I
Yeah, I didn't even get the Laserdisc at first. I remember being
the
in San
Laserdisc too? Yes,
Francisco.
yeah.
I even did a Vertigo tour of my own volition when I was visiting a friend in San Francisco. I forced her to go to all these locations, and yeah, and everyone had a good time. But I remember seeing the Laserdisc in Tower Records, and
Uh,
it was a little pricey at the time, and I waited. So yes, I bought that VHS, and it had a little like a gatefold
yeah,
cover and a little booklet in there,
yeah. The flap opened up. Yeah, yeah.
and then the DVD came out, and I purchased that too. But that was, yeah, like you mentioned, it was early in the format's life, so it wasn't even enhanced for widescreen televisions. It was just letterboxed within a 4:3 frame, like much like Laserdiscs were.
And
And
correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the one where it had the documentary with Roddy McDowall as the narrator, but then instead of going through straightforward chronological order in terms of the production history, it talked a little bit of the production, and then it cut to a little bit of the restoration process,
yes,
and then went
yes,
back to the production and went back to the restoration in this sort of it went alternate it alternated between production and then production restoration,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, that
Had
was
two
interesting.
different kind
Yeah,
of goals and would jump back and
yeah.
forth between them.
Yeah, that was a very interesting take. Oh, that's so interesting. And you know, you bring up laser discs and you bring up VHS, and
Mhm.
so we are probably in the same generation in terms of our growing up during this time in the 80s. And this was, of course, a very important time in VHS rental stores, and this was where physical
Absolutely.
media and home media really began. And so,
Yeah.
and because of where you are with your channel, Culture Dog, and your Laserdisc collection, which I want to ask you about in a moment. But
Sure.
uh, you know, while we're still here in this time,
Hmm.
you're growing up in the '80s. I was wondering if you could just let us know about your experiences with home media, your VHS or laser discs. When did they start coming in? Were you more of a VHS rental person growing up? Was that true for the films that you're watching at the time? And if so, what are some of your memories of your experiences with these rental stores and VHS? And what were some of the films that you remember exploring along the way?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this recently too, because I was on a large Apocalypse Now kick this past week. I hadn't had the chance to sit down and watch the 4K 6 disc box set that just came out about a year ago, and I sat down and watched the redo, and then the theatrical, and then the final cut, and I was making me flash back to these earlier days. I was actually essentially a baby Tarantino. I had after my parents had split, my dad was managing a number of the earliest video rental stores in Connecticut, a franchise called Video Studio. And so many of my, kind of foundational moments of enjoying film were just from living on, the weekends when I would visit him, pretty much within mostly the Avon store, and there was a few others. And that's also what introduced me to Laserdisc, because there was a Laserdisc kiosk in that store that would just spin one side of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band ad infinitum throughout the day. And so yeah, I was steeped in this world, and since my dad was the guy running the video store, I could take home tape after tape after tape, and there was a top loader VCR at the house. So I had interesting tastes at the time. Obviously, as a kid, I was drawn to. There was a Looney Tunes movie that I think it was just called the Bugs Bunny movie at the time, so I would watch that on repeat as kids would. But I also watched Goldie Hawn, and I was Chevy Chase in Foul Play. And that was one of my childhood
Yeah,
favorites,
yeah,
watching that on repeat.
yeah,
I must have popped it in when my
yeah.
dad was out of the room or something, and it was too late. And but yeah, so it was to be this interesting mix of kids movies and things that were a little bit either beyond me or, in horror films. I saw Halloween on VHS at a relatively young age. There was a situation where my dad was then dating this woman who had a couple kids of her own, and they were much older than me, and they would run out and see all the new horror films, when they dropped. I remember them going to see The Fog, on opening night, and I was so upset that I couldn't go with them. And so yeah, they kept telling their mom that I was this horror aficionado when I was, a little too young for some of these films. And I watched Phantasm through my fingers almost the entire way through. And there was one evening when nobody was around except for this woman that my father was dating, and she said, "Well, he loves horror movies." So she had on hand was The Rose with Bette Midler, which I ended up watching too, and it didn't really connect with me because I was far too young. And then Halloween, which completely terrified me in the best way possible. I mean, I'm sure I was scarred forever, but in such a way that it fueled this love for horror films. But yeah, these days hanging out at these stores were great because I would interact with the customers, and I vividly remember watching Being There with Peter Sellers, and absolutely not grokking and grasping what that was about. And I remember recommending that this woman was there with her child and was asking about what films to rent. Obviously, she was thinking I was going to recommend Looney Tunes films, and I was like, well, I wasn't sure on Being There, but I said Apocalypse Now, I definitely recommend. And she was a little shocked by that, and at that point, I had seen it quite a number of times, and that was, and again, so much of it went over my head, but I had no concept of the complexities of the Vietnam War, or even, I had not read Heart of Darkness, or any of the kind of subtext going on in the film, but on a visceral kind of visual level, it certainly connected with me. And so I was just thinking about that moment watching Apocalypse Now, how I was this little, junior Tarantino hanging out in the rental stores, telling these people to watch that. And I also vividly remember being at the gentleman who owned the entire franchise had a super bachelor pad. It was just a condominium in Avon, Connecticut. But I remember it had these cathedral ceilings, and he had a projection television, really large at the time. It probably wasn't that big, but maybe 60 inches at the most or something to that effect. But I was completely stunned. And my father was doing some sort of work for him, and needed me to watch some movies or something in the meantime while he ran off and did this work. So he put in Darby O'Gill and the Little People, and I was like, all right, that's cool. So Sean Connery, I was getting an introduction to Sean Connery, which is certainly necessary. And then I remember seeing on the top of the TV Raiders of the Lost Ark written in Sharpie on a sticky on the side, label on the side of a VHS tape. And this was when Raiders of the Lost Ark had been in theaters for a very short while. And again, another seminal moment. I remember buying the when they used to have the program guides, or they were essentially magazines for some of the films, but I remember buying the magazine and reading up on everybody that was involved in the making of the film, and discovering all these different people that I ended up following throughout their careers, and just learning all the names of the side actors and the smaller actors, and that really stuck with me. And it introduced me to Pat Roach, the stuntman, who played a number of different characters in there, but these little moments stuck in there. So I was really into Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I convinced my dad to put that in, and it was a tape. And I've heard other people mention this tape. Apparently it was making the rounds. I don't know if it was an Academy screener or something like that had been duped and passed around, but one of my favorite YouTubers, Zara Nizarak, often also references the same situation, as it was letterboxed, and that was my first real encounter with widescreen on a 4:3 home video. And I just remember thinking, I didn't understand it. I hadn't really thought about the concept of some films being 2.35 times wider than they were tall, and some films weren't. I just, I just saw the movies in the theaters, and but I thought aesthetically that looked fantastic, and there was something really, really cool about it. So I was attracted to letterboxed images even before I really knew what they represented or what they were. So that was an amazing moment. And then, yeah, more rental stores opened up. We always had memberships at all the local franchises. I remember in the early days, it wasn't quite as easy. You had to have like a membership for each particular location, and they would also rent VCRs. So sometimes we would rent an extra one and make copies of tapes over the weekend, that sort of thing. And just so many films. Yeah, and at that point, I didn't have a Laserdisc player in the house, so we were renting a lot, and there was a mix of me taping things off of HBO and the movie channel. So yeah, for the most part, I was in the theaters quite often. But then when I was at home, I was watching those 4:3 formatted for your television films, and it took me quite a few years to get into Laserdisc after that. But so many classic moments. And then as the 90s hit, at the latter end of my kind of VHS experience, that also informed my quote unquote career as a cineast, because they would start to have really, really amazing deals on catalog titles that were there was a chain called Video Galaxy, and they had quite a number of Connecticut stores. And I could go in and get maybe 4 or so films and then go home and just devour them. And that was my little bit young adult Tarantino phase, where I'd go pile up the Kieslowski, and just, I had this list. I would keep this little handwritten list of all these films that I thought were interesting, I heard other people talk about, and that I thought I should see. And I would just run loose in the store and grab armloads. And then you would also have, with this special deal, was only a few dollars, and then you'd have, I think, a good 4 or 5 days to watch the films. And so I'd grab an armload and then go home and one after the other just start tearing through them. So yeah, the rental stores were key, certainly, for my film experience. Anchored with seeing films in the cinemas as often as possible.
Yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying, and it brings back so many memories for me as well, because I also am a VHS rental generation kid.
Sure.
And so I was also living in Connecticut around the same time. So the stores that were near to me there the local stores, and then later on when Blockbuster started to appear.
I remember it well.
Yeah, so my local, the one that I would go to would be in Norwalk, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a really big one. And then also for purchases for VHS titles, it would be Suncoast.
Oh, I remember that.
Yes, Suncoast. And I remember, as I mentioned many times, I was living in the United States at the time. Mm-hmm. And so this was around the time where you could get the VHS tape of Akira. That was when this hit in North America for the first time. I also
Streamline
remember
dub. I had that.
Yeah, the Streamline. yes. And what? Wow, it's Leonardo. Yeah. And and that was an amazing experience watching that as a kid, and also I was able to get the production report on VHS, which was
very nice.
Kind of it was an interview with the Otomo and others, and that was a really great one. It was very short, but it was worth it. And then I remember also it's in Blu-ray news recently because of the Arrow release in North America, which is Tetsuo, the Iron Man. And I remember seeing that box, the silver green box. In, I think it was Blockbuster, and then it was also on sale for like $40 or something like that.
I get that a lot with people talking about laser discs. It's people remember the sell-through prices of VHS a lot, but a lot of times there were films that were not available for sell-through. I remember, it was a big deal when Beverly Hills Cop and Batman and those films were available for $20 or so, or 25 for you to purchase, but everything else was essentially the same price as the rental stores would pay for them, and sometimes they would creep up, around $100 or more. So Laserdisc was oftentimes a bargain against those tapes, which is pretty fascinating. But yeah, so I'm purchasing the same thing. I remember some of those bigger, kind of tentpole releases, and everyone in America seemed to pick those titles up. But I also loved the rental stores would buy so many titles to have the hot new releases, enough copies to make money off of them. And then after the title had simmered down a little bit, they would offload their old stock. And I just have these memories of being out on these gorgeous summer days on these the strip malls, like outside, and all these tables of VHS tapes would be out there, and I could just kind of pick and choose and grab whatever I wanted. So I started building up my own little library of tapes that way. So many things I didn't have to pay $100 for them, which was nice.
And it was that those are the days. And I also remember I think it was I forget the exact circumstances, but maybe it was like you could write in, and you could send it in the mail, and then it was CBS Fox would send you a couple tapes from their catalog or something. So I remember, it was vague. It's vague now, but I remember perhaps through those circumstances, our family received VHS tapes, CBS Fox, of Alien and Aliens, and then Star Wars.
Yep.
And so we had that was really great. And I still remember that lovely CBS Fox logo when it appeared with the lines, and and it appeared and it merged, and it was like da da da. And then other things too, little things, right? That it's so charming to remember. But if you wanted to record on a VHS tape, and then you wanted to save the recording, you had to take that little tab off.
Yes.
Side there, and then you had to think, should it be an EP mode or something? How's the tracking? And then how gutted I'd feel so shocked and so sad if I rent a tape from a VHS store and I put it in. I realized that the person before me who'd rented it didn't rewind it.
Yes.
I had to rewind the tape, and I just remember those feelings, and then just that extra added sense of responsibility before I returned the tape. I really had to rewind this and spend that extra whatever it was, 3 to 5 minutes to rewind the tape, right? And if it had 2 tapes, oh goodness,
even worse.
Those are the days, huh? Those are the days.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do remember a friend of mine, I for some reason never managed to land a position working at a record store, a video store, or a rental shop. Mm-hmm. I certainly tried. And maybe they thought I was just far too eager. And I would often help people because I guess I had a look about me that seemed like I was someone who worked at one of these facilities. So I would get questions all the time and would answer them and lead people to the sections and find the films for them as a mercenary. But I could never quite land a job working at a rental store. And perhaps maybe it was to spare me from being disappointed by the reality of, dealing with the public, and some of the sheen, the luster of that would have been taken off for sure. But when a friend of mine landed the job, I remember just hanging out because I was a young man, maybe barely getting ready to leave high school, and he would just let me borrow things forever. And the 2 tapes thing reminded me that's when I grabbed Kurosawa's Kagemusha, and I knew of his connection with Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas, and I vividly remember being in the lobby of one of the art house cinemas in Hartford, Connecticut, and seeing the huge poster for Ron there, and all the acclaim for it. And then I was hearing the tales of the Hidden Fortress, having an inspiration on Star Wars, and so I was like, we really need to check this out. And so I remember that tape having 2 separate tapes, and you had to put it in that rewinder and wait a minute before bringing it back, or else you got that. Luckily, my friend didn't charge me if I forgot to rewind the tapes, but it was an honor system.
Yeah, and they even had machines that were their own videotape rewinders. Yes, you mentioned that now, and I remember that. Gosh, those were the days.
Yes.
My goodness. Yeah, and then so from VHS, you had mentioned in that really great description that you gave, you'd mentioned about how you started to become aware of laser discs.
Hmm.
And so I have to now ask you, my friend,
Yeah.
so what then prompted your entry into the Laserdisc world such that you are to bring you to the place that you are now as one of the premier collectors in the world of Laserdiscs?
Thank you, my friend. Yeah, it's a multi-pronged attack. Like I mentioned before, I had encountered the format in the very late '70s when DiscoVision started, which was the first essentially failed attempt at introducing Laserdisc to the market. It was a joint effort um, between a number of parties, especially including MCA, because they were ponying up their catalog of films, and the production plant in California just the quality control just wasn't there. But I remembered seeing those discs in the rental store, and I vividly remember being in there used to be a lot of electronic shops and appliance stores, big box stores, and you could go in and hang out and see all the huge TVs in there. And I remember sitting and watching Flash Gordon on Laserdisc on a projection TV when my parents were probably shopping for a turntable or something like that. So those moments kind of stuck in my mind, and home theater was always a goal of mine. I still have these drawings I did in elementary school of giant televisions. I would draw up these fantastical drawings of my imagined room, my dream room, and I would have my bed there and a huge television with Star Wars playing on it and all this equipment hooked up to it. So that was the goal for since I was a kid. But the Laserdisc connection, after those earlier kind of seed moments, I didn't think that much about it until I started collecting. You mentioned Akira, a seminal anime release. I remember starting to collect those the films and the original video animations at conventions on video cassette. Not officially legal per se, but hopefully the statute of limitations has run out. But these vendors would be selling these tapes, so I would get Captain Harlock and Dirty Pair, and some of my just favorite shows, Macross, and I would get these tapes home, and when you'd play them, there would always be this bright blue screen, and then the words play and that kind of blocky 1980s style font would happen. And I was like, well, what? It didn't look quite like any of the VCRs that I had used. I'm like, what are these recorded on? And then that's when I realized that these vendors were all importing laser discs and just making dubs of them left and right and then reselling them at a profit at conventions. And so I realized, wow, if I can get a Laserdisc player, I can just cut out the middleman. And so that was what kind of fueled my drive to get a Laserdisc player. And this was probably early '90s before I really put that on the front burner. And then I started writing in for catalogs. There was a ton of retailers. A lot of San Francisco companies were selling these discs, and I was looking at the catalogs, and the prices in United States dollars were pretty astronomical. So for a box set, hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and even individual titles weren't that cheap. So I saw that kind of pumped the brakes a little bit, but not far enough. And the final, the kind of straw that broke the camel's back was the Aliens director's cut, the special edition that James Cameron dropped on video in the very early '90s, and that received a lot of media attention. And I was enough of a fan of Aliens. I'd seen it theatrically a number of times, and I'd watched it on tape so many years since then. And I remember reading about it, and I'm like, oh, this is quite a bit of extra footage, and I'm really excited to see this. And I remember being in I believe it was a Coconuts. There was a number of these kind of stores that had food names. There was Strawberries, Coconuts. I think there was a Bananas. I don't know, but they all had records and tapes and videos. And I remember holding it in my hand and thinking, wow, this is cool. Didn't have a player. And that box set was at least $100. So I was like, all right, well, maybe someday. And not too long after, a friend of the family had bought a Laserdisc player, and that was the first thing he bought, and invited us over. And he had just whipped together a little, makeshift home theater in his basement with speakers he had hanging around, and a ProLogic, capable surround sound receiver, and an entry level Laserdisc player. But he had that Aliens box set, and that was the introduction, in person, the reintroduction that really sealed the deal for me. And that by 1993, I'd gone and picked up the first Laserdisc I bought were at Suncoast. Hadn't arrived yet in the malls, but it was a Saturday Matinee was the name of the store, and I picked up Project A-ko and Alien 3, David Fincher's Alien 3. And then I went and bought a player at Filene's, a department store, and they had one on display that had been sitting around for a while because nobody shopped for Laserdisc players at Filene's. And I ran home, and that was the end of it. I just kind of, the addiction never stopped from that point on.
That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. And it reminds me also of around that time, I think Laserdiscs were starting to get a lot of, not a lot, but for instance, Siskel and Ebert would sometimes take some of their time in their shows, whatever was half an hour show, they'd have maybe a little segment at the end, not all, but sometimes they'd feature the Laserdisc and how it was a really great advance for home media entertainment because of its oftentimes it really sought to preserve the integrity of the video quality, at least compared to VHS at the time. And this was a big deal before
absolutely.
DVD, before Blu-ray. And so I remember in particular, I hope my memory is correct on this, but there was one segment with Siskel and Ebert when they were really singing the praises of, I want to say it was the Criterion release of Dracula.
Yes, with the editing feature.
Yes, you could make your own. Yes, you could make your own little. You could choose the takes of Keanu Reeves, and you could make your own little scene. So yeah, so there. And I remember this feature, looking at that. This is so fascinating, and to see all these different takes of Keanu Reeves, I thought it was really interesting in and of itself, and also because it had an interactive feature. But that was just one aspect of how. I mean, I know you've mentioned this before, but I think for a number of people, who are maybe younger, and of the younger generation, the DVD and Blu-ray generation, now UHD 4K generation, I think it's always we always have to remember that during these days, I mean, this was a big deal. Laserdisc
absolutely
was a really big deal, and they were the top of the line premier format. Very expensive, as you indicate, but just they were the cream of the crop. Really, they were.
Absolutely, and that period too, when I got involved, was really when it was that kind of golden new age of Laserdisc after DiscoVision had failed and Pioneer had bought out the format, and Philips and them implemented digital sound around the same time CDs dropped. So I mean, it just kept getting better and better and better. And then there had been letterboxed films on CED, which was a stylus, a needle read competitor video disc system to Laserdisc that had these large caddies with almost like a record on the inside with grooves that the stylus would read. They had a few films. I know Amarcord was letterboxed on there. But then, on the flip side of Woody Allen's Manhattan being letterboxed, and the Criterion Collection certainly paved the way in terms of special features, commentary tracks, and the studio started to pay attention to those Criterion releases. And so by the time I got involved, letterboxing and maintaining the theatrical aspect ratio was starting to become a regular goal of Laserdiscs. And there was just so much great material out there to pick up. Of course, as a young man, I didn't have extreme, endless amounts of funds for these types of endeavors, but I found a way to I'm picking. Sometimes I would buy used discs from some of these shops. There was a great shop in Boston called Laser Craze that would rent them and would sometimes sell their X rentals at a discount. And yeah, I found a way. It was a fantastic period for sure.
And with that, that of course led to your collecting and your hardware, and also as well as the titles that you've collected. Could you just give us a a general sense of how expansive your collection is? How many
Sure.
titles approximately do you have in all formats? And how many? What about your hardware? What's your hardware setup like? How many machines do you have? Could you give us a sense of what your collection is like now?
Sure. Now, across all formats outside of, with including VHS and DVD and Blu-ray, it's definitely a few thousand. I've definitely got more than 1,000 Laserdiscs alone. I had trimmed back my DVD collection a little bit. Um, it was a situation where I could have used the money, and then at the same hand, it gave me an excuse to rebuy those films on Blu-ray. I figured if I don't own it anymore, it was well, I need to go and get that new high definition remaster of the film. So it was a little two-edged sword there. It helped me on multiple fronts. But so yeah, there's definitely, I don't know the exact total, but definitely probably like 3,000, something like that. It's a decent amount for I call it a modest collection, but there's a lot of YouTubers out there that essentially have video stores in their homes. I'm always trying to maintain the balance of space and a reasonable house. So I've got my IKEA Laserdisc part of my collection behind me there. So yeah, and the initial collection was a few hundred, and like I mentioned before, I would get sometimes used discs. I would get them where I could find them. I joined the Columbia House Laserdisc Club, which was a fantastic resource for some of the pricier discs. The Star Wars trilogy you could get for $1 a pop and then pay for the shipping. And so it was great. And you just had to promise to purchase a few other titles in the next year or two. So many of my films I got through that. And then, Suncoast, stores like Saturday Matinee, and then these Tower Records. I would make trips to Boston on a regular basis to visit friends of mine in college up there, and I would take the time to go to Laser Craze and Tower Records and anywhere that had lasers. They also had some rental shops in the recent environment, the near environs of my house even. So I was able to rent some things and then find out what I wanted to pick up, that sort of thing. I'd fall in love with a film like Michael Mann's The Last of the Mohicans, and then I'd go and pick it up on video. So yeah, that eventually tapped out at about a few hundred, maybe 250, 300 titles. And then DVD came, and I transitioned. I never officially abandoned Laserdisc. And in fact, I loved picking up a lot of the later release titles that were discounted greatly because of DVD. Ken Crane's was a fantastic Laserdisc superstore in California, and I would purchase from them. They were the kind of Laserdisc Amazon.com. You could get pre-orders and special deals, and I would still purchase a lot of discs from them. But it definitely simmered for a little while as I was seduced by DVD for a few years, and it's really I set myself up to get back into Laserdisc without even knowing it. By my enthusiasm for the format, all my friends would come over. We would watch these films. I would make tapes of these films. I imported the Japanese release of Army of Darkness, which was retitled Captain Supermarket, and it had the original the ending, the director's cut ending, which was a far different one than the theatrical one. And that was one of the only ways to see it at the time, except for some really murky VHS tapes that were making the rounds at the conventions. And so yeah, I would pick these things up, show them to my friends, and get them hooked on it. And within a short span of time, I somehow influenced my parents into getting a player, and two or three of my other close friends. And then as the years went on, they also moved into DVD and beyond, and they weren't quite as diehard about Laserdisc as I was. And all those discs and all those players ended up coming back my way in one shape or form in the early 2000s. And my one friend was the one that he was the first of the bunch to do that. And he's like, I've got a player, and my wife is going to kick me out of the house if I don't get the stack of discs out and this player out. And I said, I still watch him fairly regularly. Bring him over. And that really was, the impetus to start collecting again. And then I started picking up, discs on eBay, and then joining the Laserdisc Forever group, and it snowballed hard from that point on. So for the longest time, my equipment was just a simple Sony single-sided player, MDP 333. And then in the late 90s, one of the gentlemen who managed one of those Video Galaxy rental stores was getting out of Laserdisc to get into DVD. So he sold me his Pioneer CLD D504, which was my first dual-sided player, which also had AC3, so I had a 5.1 surround sound, which then in turn spurred me on to get my first 5.1 home theater receiver from Rotel, one of my favorite companies, and it had DTS in there, which was a competing 5.1 company. So then I started picking up, Jurassic Park and films on DTS on Laserdisc, and from that Pioneer, I joined those Laserdisc groups, and everything. I had received a few players from a friend, a Panasonic player from a friend, and a few other things here and there. And then once I joined Laserdisc Forever, I kind of became networked with a large group of people and started seeking things out on Craigslist, etc. So my fleet now is, it's probably under 10 players or whatever. The one I just got running recently, which I was excited about, was a Sony HIL C2EX, which is a high definition Muse Laserdisc player, which could play the 1035i Muse Laserdisc. There's only a small amount of them, but now I'm up and running with high definition discs as well. So I've got that. I've got Pioneer Elite CLD 99, which has the the glossy urushi finish on it, which I do enjoy, and just a number of players that one of my favorites is it's a rebrand of Panasonic's player, the LX900 by Quasar, and nobody really thinks much of a Quasar player, but it's a really fantastic player that's been a workhorse of mine for years. And so I've got about 10 of those, and I've had a number of DVD players over the years, a few multi-region ones. I've got a JVC that's kind of my prime workhorse for my DVDs that I've gotten from different regions, and a few Blu-ray players, and one UHD 4K player. Sadly, it's a Samsung, and they stopped supporting it, so I better hope it maintains its lifespan. We'll see where it goes from here. But so I've got at least a Laserdisc player in probably every room of the house, and there's a Blu-ray player, and I think there's a DVD player and a Blu-ray player in every room of the house. So, but just one 4K player so far.
Just one. That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. And I really want to emphasize also one of the fascinating things about your approach and philosophy is how you seem to not be adverse to a particular format here and there. In other words, you are very open to the development of formats as they emerge, and the emerging technologies up to now. And so with your knowledge and expertise, I wanted to ask your opinion as to what are some of the advantages and disadvantages that you identify with respect to the various formats that you are familiar with over the years. And maybe also, do you see any advantages or disadvantages to, say, Blu-ray versus the older formats like Laserdisc and DVD, and maybe even VHS? What is your take? What is some of the things that you've observed over the course of your many years of collecting experience?
Yeah, VHS, obviously its main disadvantage is the resolution. The prime advantage, well, some of the advantages were, of course, the the ease of use and the ability to record, and relatively compact, and it was very well, maybe setting the timer wasn't user friendly, but in terms of just slapping the tape into the player and going, it was pretty user friendly. And being able to record was a major kind of seismic shift in terms of watching films at home. And Laserdisc was visually a huge step forward from essentially 60% sharper than VHS. And SVHS was a competitor, but Laserdisc was essentially you were getting broadcast quality or sometimes even better versions of films in your home. So that was really impressive. And I was already impressed with the sound on Laserdisc. In the early days, it was analog sound, which was stereo, but would often have surround tracks encoded into that stereo track. And as the years went on, 5.1 surround sound was released on Laserdisc, and I was continually blown away by the advances the format made over the years. Visually, the downsides of Laserdisc were some of the same things, because it was composite video. Some of the similar issues VHS had much better resolution, but there was still noise in the chroma and luma, and depending on the player you had and how you had it hooked up, sometimes you could get like rainbow effects from a poor comb filter, and when things were flashing across the screen with fine lines, and sometimes you would have a little bit of color bleeding and stuff. Not as bad as with VHS, but it was one of those things where the benefits obviously far outweighed the deficits for the format. But occasionally, if you didn't have top-notch gear, there was a little bit of noise, especially in like magentas and reds and things like that. So that was one of the first things that blew me away with DVD, was the stability of the colors. And at the times, I was almost blind to the negative effects of DVD, especially early on, which was digital compression artifacts, what they would call macro blocking, where you would see little blocky pixels or clumps of pixels, etc. And I was just so stunned by the fidelity of the color that it kind of helped me overlook those deficits. Sound on Laserdisc was tough to beat, and especially in terms of the mixes being used. Sometimes were just straight ports of theatrical mixes, and it was before it was an official kind of industry standard to make two separate mixes, one for theaters and then one they would call the near field mix for a home theater, considering that you're in a small room with monitors that are much closer to you than they would be in a huge amphitheater. And that's caused a lot of kind of furor on the internet that carries on to this day. But DVD was fascinating because it was this weird juncture between the convenience of VHS and the feature-rich elements of Laserdisc. And there was this weird period when nobody knew where it was going to go. And there were companies like Circuit City that were trying to brand their own disposable versions. They had one called DivX that would you would use it and it would destroy itself within a certain amount of time, and it would not have letterbox copies. So as fans, we didn't know if DVD was going to become the new VHS fully and just embrace full screen, cropped images and recomposed to fit your television. So it was a really interesting Wild West period. And that, of course, led to Kevin Smith kind of dropping some epithets on his Chasing Amy commentary track from the Criterion Collection, where he had cast some aspersions on DVD. But that said, the portability, the ease of use, and of course, Laserdisc 2 used to get a lot of flack for only being able to store at the most an hour of film content per side. That never really bothered me. I always saw that as an analog to changing reels in the cinema. I always felt like I was my own little projectionist, and I'd have to change the reels, and it would kind of give a break. You can let your friends run off and get some snacks or visit the bathroom. But DVD, obviously, with the layer changes, allowed you to watch a film straight through if you so chose. and then, yeah, when I saw commentary tracks and things like that started to get ported over, I was definitely excited about it. And the um, the catalog was rich. It was definitely, there were some elements of Laserdisc where I felt weren't as effective as VHS, mostly in terms of music releases and horror films. VHS is still to this day a playground for horror films, and Laserdisc was very specific. There are some fantastic music releases on Laserdisc, but there were a lot of kind of glaring omissions and things that I had on VHS that really should have been on Laserdisc. And DVD seemed to have the same strength of catalog. And I would go into places like Media Play, which was a kind of new, it was a bit of everything, books and software and films and CDs. And I would sit in there and they had this huge horror section. And that's when I used to love that all these kind of cult films were receiving the love that the Criterion Collection had lavished on important films and French cinema and everything that was deemed not worthy of that kind of Criterion like treatment. Other companies like Anchor Bay, Blue Underground were starting to kind of pick that up, that the ideals that Criterion had set forth, and ran with it, started releasing these fantastic special editions on DVD. And the fact that I could get like Dario Argento's Tenebrae on DVD for $25-$30, it seems a little pricey, but at the time, having been purchasing Laserdisc over the years, the Rhone Group Laserdisc of that was far pricier. So it was kind of a real exciting time. So I definitely overlooked any deficiencies of DVD and Blu-ray. I knew there was a competitor called HD DVD, and people were drawing their lines in the sand. And I firmly was on the side of James Bond films, and the James Bond catalog was in the paws of Sony at the time. And I realized I'm going where James Bond is going, and so I definitely went into Blu-ray early on, and was absolutely blown away by the fidelity. That's when I finally was able to, shortly before I got into Blu-ray, I was finally able to achieve the dream of purchasing a projector. I'd been keeping an eye on digital projectors over the years and seeing digital films in theaters and wondering how the contrast levels, when they were going to get to a point where it would be a good compromise to get away from CRT televisions and jump into that format. And I finally did get a projector in the early 2000s, maybe 2004. And that completely changed how I view films, and just kind of enlarging my screen and my mind. And so shortly after I got that, I got into Blu-ray and was completely blown away. And the deficits of Blu-ray is that still you have those near field mixes. Some people complain that aren't quite as dynamic as the original theatrical mixes. And then you still have the color timing, as people are just adjusting the colors of films with software. You have a film like David Fincher's Seven, where on the Criterion Collection, Laserdisc was scanned from one of the original prints that had this really amazing procedure to retain the silver in it. And every version on DVD and Blu-ray after that was a recreation of that in software instead of an actual scan of that print. So, and there's so many opportunities for someone to get things wrong, like the tennis ball in The Shining ends up looking pink in one scene in the Blu-ray, the original Blu-ray. It's been reissued now on 4K UHD and Blu-ray. But so yeah, and I don't really take those to heart as much, mostly because I see, I don't know, people tend to think it's something that is a modern problem. But as far as films being transferred to home video, there's always been some sort of issue. In the 90s, it was early digital noise reduction, and it was bad scanning capabilities in the 80s. And there's always a give and take, and there's always some progress made, and then sometimes people there's that kind of trend of recoloring films with that teal and orange kind of color palette, because it's more in tune with what audiences are used to seeing nowadays, and there's this psychological effect of it too. But there's enough that are, kind of, they just hit it out of the park. There's enough of those instances that I can overlook any of the issues. And I think, in general, film telecine operators are trying to do a good job, and they might kind of drop the ball occasionally, but there's definitely some moments you're watching these films on UHD and Blu-ray where, I feel like I've got a cinema in my living room. UHD is interesting for me now. It's still relatively early, and this whole concept of high dynamic range it's still a little bit of a Wild West in my mind, kind of coming to grips of how cinematic it is. It almost seems like beyond like the cinematic experience. It seems like almost like a uniquely video experience in terms of the way things pop off the screen. So I'm not 100% sure where that fits in my kind of estimation of formats and how they represent cinema. But that said, Blu-ray, I've got a copious collection of Arrow videos, and when I put on Shinjuku Triad Society films from that box set, and at 2 a.m. and my wife's sleeping, I just feel like I just turned on the projector in my own personal cinema, and I just sat down and somebody ripped my ticket, and I'm experiencing a 35mm film. It's really, really close. So I cherish that experience.
Wow.
So I think that's it.
Wow. That is amazing. I really admire the philosophy and approach that you have about this. Incidentally, what about streaming services for you?
I enjoy streaming in the same way I used to enjoy renting tapes, and I see it as an interesting, part of the film experience, and being able to access titles. And I'm definitely a subscriber of Amazon Prime and Netflix, and I also have little add-ons like Shudder, which is a horror-centric service, and HBO and all those things. I tend to try and seek out films that I know I love. For the first time, I'm still on physical media. I'm definitely not going to tire of physical media, just in terms of, I have a relatively decent bandwidth at my house, but there's just too much of a variability in terms of quality of the streaming. There's the cases where you start a film up and the first minute is very, very low resolution and pixelated and murky if the stream isn't running at optimum speed. And so I see it as a very kind of disposable but still necessary format, or not even really a format, but definitely something that I do consume, and in terms of television shows and films and that. But if it's something I know I love, I'm definitely going to purchase it. Just recently I double dipped on A24's Midsummer, which was one of my absolute favorite films of the previous year, and I had bought the Blu-ray, and that was available on streaming in the director's cut, and I have completely avoided viewing it because that's a film I love, and I don't want to see that director's cut for the first time and leave it up to the chance of me dropping a feed or some sort of glitches or playback. So I just purchased a special edition that A24 was selling directly to the fans, and so there's room for it in my life, but there's an extent to the kind of amount of leeway I'll give streaming.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really, really interesting. Yeah. And I mean, it's still something that is, I would say that it's, for many people, I think people are reading the tea leaves, so to speak, and it's a matter of when rather than if, in terms of current physical media markets, at least from the perspective of some people. And I must admit too that I'm a big physical media fan as well, but I wouldn't be surprised if we heard some news anytime soon. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope it goes on for a long time. But even whatever happens, we'll still have the market like the Laserdisc market is now, Same is true for the VHS market. And I think also we see some of the risks as well in terms of availability of films versus the sudden lack of availability of films.
Yes, yeah.
And we see how streaming can be very sensitive to those sorts of issues. I mean, those issues have occurred before in terms of what's been made available and what's out of print. Yeah, and those, I mean, those aren't new issues, and those aren't, those have always been around ever since the whole concept of commercial distribution has taken a hold of the market. So, but those are continue, but they are becoming quite prevalent in our collecting communities, as it were, as you know. So, you know,
yeah, that's an interesting thing about physical media is this unique little thing. You know, same thing with vinyl and CDs and stuff. It's actually been produced. It exists, and when that film or those rights lapse and the film goes out of print, the discs are still out there and you can still hunt them down. So I'm always fascinated by that, the permanency, assuming they don't rot or fall apart through the years as they oxidize or whatever. But I'm always fascinated by that permanency. And I would always get into these lively debates with friends of mine that were very much so in love with the idea of streaming, especially when Netflix first dropped, and they had a vision of this dream of being able to view any content in the world at the drop of a hat and everything being at your fingertips. And I would always counter argue that the kind of snaky labyrinthine world of rights management is, if you're going to have that world, it's going to be in terms of piracy and places that were letting loose Blu-ray rips and things like that. And maybe then you could have everything. But as long as we have actual media rights, things are going to lapse all the time. And there's that dismaying situation of when something lapses, it's gone from the radar in terms of streaming, whereas there's still a disc out there. One of my kind of favorite moments of that is the really fascinating film Incubus with William Shatner. And it was filmed by a large number of people that were working on The Outer Limits. It's shot in Esperanto. It's a real fascinating, really interesting occult film. And it had this huge kind of urban legend behind it about it being a cursed film. And at one point, they managed to find a decent print of it. And it was found in France, if I remember correctly. And it had burned in French subtitles on the print. So it was available on DVD, which I bought in Tower Records in Boston on the corner of Mass Ave and Newbury Street, my favorite stomping grounds. I purchased it there, and they actually had to put black bars over the French subtitles to put the English subtitles, because the film was in Esperanto, which doesn't have a huge base of speakers currently. But I just remember seeing that and thinking, wow, this is a real fascinating film. And I was part of a kind of guerrilla group of rebel, film exhibitors in the 2000s. I eventually formed a legit above ground group called the Capital Cinema Collective, and we ran an international film festival in Hartford, Connecticut for 3 years. But before that, the seeds of that group were laid in a amazing coffee shop that a friend of mine had opened, Luis Cotto, called what was the name again? It's of course the name of the shop is avoiding me at the moment, eluding me. But La Paloma Sabanera was the name of the coffee shop, and his concept was that it would be a third space, somewhere out of the home, out of the workplace, where people can gather and have conversations and change the neighborhood, network, that sort of thing. And anything to do with the arts he was behind, and would have jazz festivals and poetry readings and everything. And there was a bunch of us film nerds that decided to start this group called Kino Cafe. And I absolutely loved pulling titles off of my shelves and showing films there. I showed La Jetée there one time, and it was a great time. And I specifically wanted to show Incubus one time when we were actually under the umbrella of someone's LLC and we had to keep things above board and maintain the rights. And I actually tried to contact the the rights holders for the film, and then I discovered along the way that everything had lapsed, and that the company who had the rights for the DVD had gone out of print. They had lost the rights to the film. It had lapsed back to the producer of the film, and the producer of the film had just disappeared off the grid. And I was trying desperately to see if I could show this film legally, and it was near impossible. So that's the kind of thing that we're facing in terms of content being available. So yeah, some night you might want to watch Incubus. I have a DVD of it. It's in my collection and it's not going anywhere, but it will disappear and return possibly on streaming. I had a much more common film. Just the other night, we wanted to watch Airplane. My wife wanted to watch Airplane, the 1980 comedy, and we found it available from CBS All Access. So I said, I'll try. They have a couple programs I wouldn't mind checking out. So I'll try a 7-day, trial and check it out. And whatever copy of it they had, the audio and the video were lagging, and it wasn't anything I could replicate with any other content they had. So it definitely didn't seem to be derived from my bandwidth or something on my end, hardware wise or software wise. It seemed to be whatever digital file they had of this film, or however they were transmitting it, was a good 20-second delay in audio, and it rendered it unwatchable. So our delightful evening of watching Airplane and laughing on the couch was derailed almost immediately. And I went on Amazon and saw that there's a special edition DVD about to drop in a couple weeks, and pre-ordered it. So physical media saves the day yet again.
Yes, it's a big, pretty white plane with curtains on the windows and wheels, and it looks like a big
Yes.
Tylenol. Yes. That's that one of the it's just one of those things, right? We always have to rely on the physical media aspect. Still, it's always reliable that way. You're absolutely right. Absolutely. So I'd like to just say, thank you. Winding down here, it's such a great opportunity to hear your perspective on this, and I wish we had more time for this. But if it's okay, would you be open to coming back?
Absolutely.
And we can talk more specifics. I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know you're busy, so thank you so much for this great conversation. And I want to say also your wonderful channel, which is called Culture Dog, is absolutely splendid. It's, as I say, it's one of the channels that I have watched since way back. It's you through that I learned about you, and through that channel many aspects of collecting and physical media and hardware, and it's still going strong. And so please, could you let us know a little bit about the channel and what things you have upcoming plans for it, as far as any videos that I know you have a great series now. What is it, Wolfpack?
Yes,
I love that. I love the group there. So please, everyone, give everyone my warmest regards. You guys do such a great job there. But please, could you let us know about the Culture Dog and what it is and what plans you have for any upcoming videos going forward?
Sure. Yeah. Like I mentioned, I'd been doing a radio show called Culture Dogs with my friend Kevin O'Toole since 2002. And I had underestimated YouTube, and especially as a social media platform. I had a music show that I had a channel that would have interviews with musicians on there. So I had that for a number of years, but I never really grasped like the amount of interaction with the fans and subscriptions and all that sort of thing. So then I thought, well, maybe I'll have another channel, because you can set up different channels under your Google profile. And so I set up one. So I thought maybe this could be a little more film related, somehow connected with my radio show. So that's why even on my early videos, it would say Culture Dog Unleashed, because this was supposed to be my chance to step away from the confines of, the radio show and, the time limits. And it was my chance to just say whatever I wanted, spend as long as I wanted, sometimes to much people's chagrin, but just to kind of, wax philosophical about my favorite things. But it still took a while to kind of get a feel for it. There was a couple of things. I put up some concert footage of things. I'm like, well, maybe I was going to do some sort of multimedia, get into music and movies and a few different things. But then I started, maybe it was 2014. I had the channel up for a number of years, and it was essentially dormant. And I decided to do the Halloween challenge in the month of October to watch a horror film for every day of the month. So I did that, and then Laserdisc was always something I was passionate about, and even doing those videos, I thought, well, I have this channel, I should really just kind of tell my Laserdisc story, or where it led to at that point. So my third video that I'd released was a video entitled Laserdisc, I think Why It Ruled and Still Does. And that just kind of started gathering steam, and it must have kind of been part of the YouTube algorithm, that kind of mythical algorithm that's so ephemeral, and people chase it down, and sometimes it works in your favor and sometimes it doesn't. And I just noticed that video picking up steam, and I thought, well, I certainly love, and I was just having a really good time interacting with the commenters. And I heard a lot of people complain about YouTube and YouTube, the comments and how toxic it can be. But I discovered early on that that's just if you just kind of leave your lawn untended and just let it grow wild. I discovered that if I took the time to interact and kind of make it a community, it was really fantastic. So all these people that, other people that had these great feelings of nostalgia about the format and kind of reliving these halcyon years of Laserdisc collecting, and then just other people that were really into films that it didn't even really matter about the format it's on, just hearing people talking about films they loved. I just started having a great time kind of going back and forth with people, and it snowballed from there. And I'll occasionally branch out and do some Blu-ray reviews and things like that. But I've always got a laundry list of topics I want to cover. Kind of, I try and mix it up with what I've picked up on Laserdisc and simple videos like that, with like a little bit more deeper cuts. Sometimes I'll get into the history of the format a little bit, or I last year tackled finally Laserdisc audio, which is so complicated it necessitated 5 separate videos. But there's always some, as I keep learning about the format more and more over the years, and different pressings and all of this kind of Laserdisc minutia. There's just far more things for me to talk about. So I've been having a great time over the years, and just interacting with people, and then eventually started doing live streams. I did a podcast. I started as an audio-only podcast with my friend Moiki and Sean Robert Gillette, who was a moderator on Laserdisc Forever. And we had a run of that for a while. And after about 11 or 12 episodes, we tried to get it going again, and it never quite caught up to speed, and schedules didn't work out. And then,
fan of that. A huge fan of that.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. I remember you mentioning that, listening to it on the train or something at some point, and I thought that was the coolest. And then, we ended up getting a number of other people that I'd been friends with from the Laserdisc forums, and then we all kind of, would chat together on a regular basis. And then as just this one-off kind of display of my friend Ryan Cushing's recent acquisition of, he gets tons and tons of Laserdiscs in the wild in the greater Chicago area. And so we had a podcast, and it was so much fun that we've been doing it every other week ever since then. So we've got another one scheduled for this coming Friday on the that'll be the 10th of or is that the 11th? Forgot what. Actually, it probably won't drop until Sunday, July 12th. That'll be when I'll upload that. But we will be recording it this weekend. And it's been going great. I do have some topics. I finally went and dove into aspect ratios in terms of watching letterboxed films on 4:3 laser discs on modern HD TVs, and how interestingly complicated that can become, and how to deal with it. So that took a lot out of me. That took a lot of effort and research into it. I've got one on tap, or that's planned, getting into aspect ratios again, but in terms of films that weren't shot in scope, like 2.35 to 1, films that were shot in a full aperture and then were later matted theatrically, and how those were brought on home video, sometimes with more top and bottom imagery than was seen theatrically, and if that's correct or not. And it's strangely complicated. So I'm going to do a video on that, and some other kind of gimmies. I still have not discussed the big Star Wars definitive collection box set, and I've been pushing that video off for years and years. It's a really, really deep dive. So yeah, I spend a lot of time going over old magazines. I cherish these old magazines like Widescreen Review, because there's this time capsule, and you can really get a ground level, viewpoint and flashback in time as to what was going on. So I love just kind of diving into the past and the history of the format, and then kind of thinking of a way to craft a new video talking about that. So I've got a few of those kind of big topic videos on the horizon, and then I'll, in the meantime, pepper in collection updates and simple things like that along the way, and the occasional spotlight. I recently decided to start kind of expanding my spotlights, just because I'm so fascinated by the history. So I've been studying old Billboard magazines and any kind of things that would have a video column of the time, to get a real feel for it, and looking at old Google chat pages from the early Usenet kind of bulletin board things, and what Laserdisc aficionados were thinking about these releases when they were originally released. So it causes far too much more time out of my schedule, but I do get a joy out of it. And so now I'm trying to kind of bring even a little bit more of a historical aspect to my Laserdisc spotlight videos, where I talk about what it cost when it was released, and if it was pushed back, and what it felt like at the time if I was around collecting Laserdisc when it was released. So I just kind of want to recapture the joy and the fun of what it was like to be there, if I can. So yeah, hopefully I try to maintain a steady stream of content, and occasionally it ebbs and flows accordingly, depending on what's going on in my life at the time. But it's my absolute favorite outlet of what I do creatively. So
well, it is amazing. It is absolutely
Thank
fantastic. One of my favorite places to go, so Culture Dog, it is one of the premier places to go. So I strongly recommend it if you don't know it already, but chances are you do, because it's such a legendary place. But Sam Hatch at Culture Dog, thank you so much for giving us some of your very valuable time today. I really appreciate it, my friend. I really do.
Yeah, anytime. And we didn't even get to talk about James Bond or Big Trouble in Little China, other important topics. So I will absolutely come back whenever you'll have me.
Sam is a big fan of 007, 007, and also he is a huge fan of Big Trouble in Little China. And so we must talk. I've begun talking with Spencer, our dear friend Spencer, about James Bond.
And after you had asked me to come on the show, I purposely didn't watch, just because I didn't want to, I don't know, I just didn't want to kind of have, the same kind of, I didn't want the information of what possibly would be coming my way. I just wanted to be completely fresh and give you the opportunity to, I didn't know if you were going to be asking some of the same questions. And so I wanted to, maintain that level of spontaneity. But now, that I've spoken with you, I can go and watch the Spencer video. So
that's all me. That's all on me. I apologize for my poor planning. I should have planned this out better. But that means that we must have you back again. So if that's okay, let's talk again, and we can. It'll be my pleasure to welcome you again, and we can talk more about these and other topics if that's okay.
And likewise, we'd love to have you, chatting about your Criterion collection on the Laserdisc Wolfpack podcast at some point. So,
One of my great dreams. Oh my God. No
so
pressure, of course. No pressure. I understand
we'll be
it's a
reaching
hard
out to you.
thing.
Don't
So,
worry.
yeah, but thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Well, once again, thank you so much for your time, Sam, and we will
My
talk
pleasure.
again very soon. Once again, it's Culture Dog. All the information will be below. Check it out. Subscribe to it. Thumbs up. Hit the notification. It's fantastic. So,
Yeah.
once again, thank you so much for your time, Sam, and we will talk again very soon. And be well.
Honored.
Take very good care of
Thank you. You
yourself.
too.
And stay safe and be well.
Stay safe. Yeah. Enjoy. I'll talk to you soon.
Likewise, my friend.